Previously, on the Astor mansion that started a war. Caroline Astor, the Mrs. Astor, ruled New York society from her brownstone at 350 Fifth Avenue. For 30 years, her ballroom had been the ultimate destination. Her approval, the ultimate prize. Her exclusion, social death. But when her nephew, William Waldorf, demanded that his wife be called Mrs. Astor, Caroline refused. The title was hers, and she would not surrender it. William Waldorf was furious, and he began planning a revenge so audacious, so unprecedented, that it would force Caroline to abandon her home and reshape Fifth Avenue forever. His weapon? Not social power, not political connections. Commerce. He was going to bring business, noise, and strangers to Caroline's doorstep. He was going to make her fortress unlivable. And it all started with the houses next door. Here's what made the situation even more delicious for gossips. The two families didn't just share a last name. They shared a wall. Literally. At 350 Fifth Avenue and 34th Street stood Caroline's brownstone, and directly next to it, at 33rd Street, stood William Waldorf's inherited mansion, the house his father had built. Two brownstones, side by side, separated by perhaps 15 feet of garden and property line. Which meant every time Caroline looked out her window, she saw her nephew's house. And every time William Waldorf looked out his window, he saw Caroline's. It was a physical manifestation of the family war, a daily reminder that they were locked in combat but trapped in proximity. Now, here's where William Waldorf got creative. He couldn't make Caroline call his wife Mrs. Astor. He couldn't force society to abandon their loyalty to his aunt. He couldn't win the social war through traditional means. But he could do something else. Something that would make Caroline's life so unpleasant, so unbearable, that she'd have no choice but to leave. He could destroy the neighborhood. Think about that strategy for a moment. It's brilliant in its cruelty. If you can't beat your enemy on their turf, you don't fight them directly. You make the turf worthless. You turn their palace into a prison. You surround them with everything they hate most. For Caroline Astor, what she hated most was commerce, trade, business. The very things that had made the Astor fortune were, in her mind, fundamentally separate from how genteel people lived. You made money in one place, downtown, in offices and warehouses. But you lived in another place, uptown, in quiet brownstones on tree-lined streets. Fifth Avenue in the 1880s and early 1890s was still mostly residential south of 51st Street. Yes, there were some shops creeping in. Yes, the Ladies' Mile shopping district was just a few blocks away. But 34th Street, that was still a proper neighborhood. Quiet, private, respectable. William Waldorf was about to change that. In 1892, William Waldorf Astor made his announcement. He was tearing down his brownstone mansion, and in its place he was building a hotel, not a small hotel, not a modest establishment. A massive, modern, 13-story hotel with over 450 rooms that would tower over Caroline's home and fill her world with noise, strangers, and commerce. He called it the Waldorf Hotel. The New York press went insane. This was the kind of story that sold papers. Family drama, immense wealth, and architectural audacity all wrapped into one. Headlines screamed about the Astor feud. Cartoonists drew caricatures of William Waldorf as a schemer and Caroline as a stubborn matriarch. But beneath the gossip was a genuinely radical idea: building a luxury hotel on Fifth Avenue. Remember, this was 1892. Hotels in New York were generally downtown, near the ports and train stations. They served travelers and businessmen. They weren't places where respectable families would want to live. But William Waldorf had spent years in Europe. He'd seen the grand hotels of Paris and London, establishments that catered to aristocrats and wealthy families. He understood that a hotel could be more than a temporary lodging. It could be a destination, a social center, a rival to the private homes of Fifth Avenue. The Waldorf Hotel opened in March 1893. 13 stories, 450 rooms, electricity throughout, private bathrooms, a shocking luxury at the time, restaurants, a ballroom, a palm garden, marble floors, gilded ceilings, every technological innovation money could buy. And it sat right next to Caroline's house, looming over it, dwarfing it, making her elegant brownstone look small and old-fashioned by comparison. But the real assault wasn't visual, it was sensory. Imagine you're Caroline Astor. You've spent 40 years building a world of quiet, controlled elegance. Your home is your fortress. Your ballroom is your throne room. Your garden is your private sanctuary. Now, every morning, you wake to the sound of construction, deliveries, carriages dropping off hotel guests. Your garden, once private, is now overlooked by hundreds of hotel windows. Your street, once residential, is now crowded with gawkers, tourists, people who don't belong. Strangers peer into your windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous Mrs. Astor. Hotel guests stroll past your gate, taking photographs. The whole neighborhood is transforming around you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. William Waldorf had won. He didn't defeat Caroline directly. He didn't steal her social power or diminish her influence. He simply made her home unlivable. And in doing so, he forced her to make the one choice she'd spent her entire life avoiding: retreat. Caroline Astor held out for 2 years. 2 years of noise, 2 years of tourists, 2 years of watching her nephew's hotel grow more successful while her mansion became increasingly irrelevant. By 1895, she'd had enough. At 65 years old, an age when most people would settle in, refuse to move, insist on dying in their family home, Caroline made a decision that would reshape Fifth Avenue and cement her place in history. She would build a new mansion. Not downtown, not anywhere near William Waldorf's hotel, but far uptown, where Fifth Avenue was still quiet, still residential, still worthy of someone with her standards. At 840 Fifth Avenue and 65th Street. Nearly 30 blocks north. Now, here's what makes this fascinating. Caroline's move wasn't a retreat. At least, she didn't see it that way. In her mind, she wasn't fleeing, she was leading. If Mrs. Astor moved north, society would follow. That was the calculation. That was the power she still believed she wielded. And she was right. But she was also wrong. Because what Caroline didn't fully grasp was that by moving, by abandoning 34th Street, she was also abandoning the old rules, the old neighborhood, the old New York she'd spent her life defending. Fifth Avenue, below 51st Street, would become commercial. Within a decade, most of the brownstones around her old mansion would be replaced by department stores, office buildings, and eventually, in 1931, the Empire State Building. And Fifth Avenue above 51st Street, where Caroline was moving, would become the new Millionaire's Row. But it would be a different kind of wealth, flashier, more competitive, less controlled. Caroline was leading society into a new era. But it was an era she wouldn't fully recognize, an era that would, ultimately, outlast her and everything she'd built. In the end, William Waldorf got what he wanted. He'd driven Caroline from her home, he'd proven his power, and he'd made a fortune from his hotel. The Waldorf was immediately profitable and became one of the most famous hotels in the world. But there's a delicious irony here. In 1897, just 4 years after the Waldorf opened, William's cousin, John Jacob Astor IV, built another hotel right next to the Waldorf. He called it the Astoria. Eventually, the two hotels merged into the Waldorf Astoria, one of the most iconic names in hospitality history. 2 Astors, 2 hotels, 1 address. And Caroline, 30 blocks away, watching her old neighborhood disappear. The family that had spent generations building Manhattan's greatest real estate empire had turned on itself, and in the process, they'd transformed an entire avenue. This wasn't just a family feud anymore. It was urban history in the making. When Caroline Astor decided to build her new mansion, she didn't hire just any architect. She hired the best, the most expensive, the man whose name was synonymous with Gilded Age grandeur, Richard Morris Hunt. Let me tell you about Hunt. He was, by 1895, in his 60s and at the absolute peak of his powers. He trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to do so. He'd designed the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. He'd built the breakers for Cornelius Vanderbilt II. He'd created Biltmore Estate for George Vanderbilt, the largest private home in America, a 250-room French Renaissance chateau in the mountains of North Carolina. In short, if you wanted a palace, you hired Hunt. And if you wanted to send a message, "I may have moved, but I'm still the Queen," you hired Hunt and told him money was no object. This is where the story becomes fascinating from an architectural standpoint. Because Hunt wasn't just designing a house for Caroline, he was designing a statement. A statement that said, "Old New York is not dead. Good taste is not dead. And I am still the arbiter of what matters." The location Caroline chose was perfect for this. 840 Fifth Avenue on the east side of the street between 65th and 66th Streets. In 1895, this area was just beginning to develop. Central Park was right across the street, a massive expanse of green that promised permanence, nature, civilization. Below 55th Street, Fifth Avenue was being devoured by commerce. But here, at 65th Street, there was space, quiet, the possibility of building something that would last. Hunt understood this, and he designed accordingly. The commission came with one unusual requirement: speed. Caroline wanted to move quickly. She was 65, not getting younger, and she wanted to host at least a few years' worth of balls in her new home before age or health made that impossible. Hunt promised her 2 years, design and construction in 24 months. It was an aggressive timeline for a house of this scale, but Hunt had the resources, the reputation, and the craftsmen to make it happen. Work began in 1893, while the Waldorf Hotel was still under construction 30 blocks south. It was a race in a way, William Waldorf building his hotel, Caroline building her palace. 2 Astors, 2 visions for Fifth Avenue. Only one would define the future. The mansion Richard Morris Hunt designed for Caroline Astor was a French Renaissance chateau transplanted to Manhattan, not French-inspired, not French-influenced, fully, unapologetically French. Limestone facade, steep slate roof with dormer windows, tall arched windows on the ground floor, ornate iron railings, carved stone details that reference the chateau of the Loire Valley, the kind of architectural language that said royalty in a way that American brownstones never could. The house was set back from the street, unusual for New York, where most mansions were built right up to the property line. But Hunt wanted Caroline's new home to have presence, to sit like a gem in a setting, surrounded by a small front courtyard and iron gates. You couldn't just walk up to Mrs. Astor's door anymore. You had to be let in. Through the gates, past the courtyard. A symbolic barrier that recreated the distance she'd lost when William Waldorf's hotel had made her old home public. The scale was larger than her previous house, but not absurdly so. Hunt understood that Caroline's power came from refinement, not ostentation. She didn't want the Breakers, that massive Vanderbilt showpiece in Newport. She didn't want Biltmore, that 175,000-square-foot mountain palace. She wanted a mansion that was impressive but tasteful, large but livable, a home that proved you could have wealth without vulgarity. The house was 4 stories tall, plus a basement and attic for servants. Roughly 35,000 to 40,000 square feet, big enough to make a statement, small enough to remain intimate. By Gilded Age standards, this was almost modest. But the details? The details were everything. Let me walk you through the exterior, because every choice mattered. The ground floor featured those tall arched windows I mentioned, each one probably 8 or 9 feet high, designed to flood the interior with light. The window treatments would have been elaborate: thick silk curtains, lace sheers, valances. From the street, you'd see glimmers of chandelier light and gilded ceilings, but never quite enough to fully reveal what was inside. The second floor, the piano nobile in architectural terms, was the heart of the house. This is where the major rooms were: the entrance hall, the drawing rooms, the ballroom. The windows here were slightly smaller but still grand, perfectly proportioned to the room heights inside. The third floor held bedrooms and private apartments. Caroline's suite would have been here, along with guest rooms for extended family visits. The fourth floor, more bedrooms, likely for adult children or close family. And above that, hidden behind the steep mansard roof, the servants' quarters. Dozens of them. Because running a house like this required a small army. Maids, cooks, footmen, butlers, valets, ladies' maids, laundry women, kitchen assistants. One historian estimated Caroline employed between 20 and 30 full-time servants in her new home. That's a small village living above your head, existing only to ensure your life runs smoothly. But here's what I want you to understand about this house. It wasn't about innovation. Hunt wasn't pushing architectural boundaries or experimenting with new styles. This wasn't the progressive architecture that was emerging in Chicago, or the arts and crafts movement that was gaining traction in England. This was conservative architecture, deliberately, proudly. It said, we don't need to invent new styles. We have centuries of European culture to draw from. We are the inheritors of civilization. And for Caroline, that message was the point. She'd been forced to move by modernity, by a nephew who understood hotels and commerce and the new economy. But she would not embrace that modernity. She would not build a modern house with modern sensibilities. She would build a chateau, a castle, a fortress against time. The house was completed in 1895, 2 years as promised. And when Caroline moved in, she brought with her everything from her old mansion. The furniture, the art, the memories, the ghosts of 30 years of social dominance. This wasn't retreat. At least, that's not how Caroline would have framed it. This was strategic relocation. This was creating a new center of power. This was saying to New York society, "Where I go, you follow." It was an audacious gamble. Here's where we hit a frustrating gap in the historical record. Unlike some Gilded Age mansions, the Breakers, Marble House, Biltmore, we don't have extensive photographic documentation of Caroline Astor's interior spaces. She was intensely private. She didn't want photographers in her home. And the house was demolished in 1926, before the era of comprehensive architectural surveys. What we have instead are fragments, descriptions from guests, auction catalogues, newspaper accounts, references in memoirs and letters. So let me reconstruct what we know, piece by piece, like an archaeological dig through words instead of stones. You enter through the front gates, across the courtyard, and through massive carved wooden doors. The entrance hall is marble. Of course it's marble. Probably pale Italian marble with darker inlays creating geometric patterns on the floor. The walls are clad in more marble, or perhaps carved wood paneling. The ceiling is high, maybe 15 or 16 feet, with elaborate plasterwork and likely a painted dome or decorative panel. A grand staircase dominates the space, not quite as theatrical as the staircase at the Breakers, but impressive nonetheless. Wide enough for a woman in a ball gown and massive trained skirt to ascend without difficulty. Carved wooden balustrades, a landing halfway up with a large window letting in north light. This entrance hall serves a purpose beyond aesthetics. It's a sorting mechanism. Guests wait here to be received. Servants appear to take coats and hats. The space is designed to make visitors pause, look around, and understand exactly whose home they're entering. From the entrance hall, you progress into the drawing rooms. And here's where Hunt really channeled his French training. The drawing rooms, probably 2 or 3 of them, each connected by wide doorways, would have been decorated in different historical styles. One room in Louis XIV style, heavy gilt, lots of carving, rich fabrics. Another in Louis XV, more delicate, rococo curves, pastel colors. Perhaps a third in a more restrained, neoclassical style. Why different styles? Because this was how French aristocrats decorated their chateau. Each room representing a different period, creating a progression through history as you moved through the house. The furniture in these rooms came from Caroline's old mansion. She'd spent decades collecting French antiques or high-quality reproductions. Tapestries, paintings, clocks, vases. Every surface covered with objects that signaled both wealth and taste. The walls would have been covered in silk damask or elaborate wallpaper. The ceilings coffered or painted with allegorical scenes. The windows dressed in multiple layers of curtains, sheers, heavy silk drapes, valances, tiebacks. It was a lot. By modern standards, we'd call it cluttered. But in the 1890s, this was the height of sophistication. Empty space was wasted space. Every inch should demonstrate your wealth, your travels, your education, your taste. And then, at the far end of this progression of drawing rooms, you reach the ballroom. This was the whole point, the reason for moving. the recreation of that magical space from her old mansion where the 400 had gathered for 30 years. The new ballroom was probably larger than the old one, maybe 60 by 80 feet. High ceilings, 20 feet or more, crystal chandeliers, mirrors along the walls to multiply the light and make the space feel even grander. A polished wood floor for dancing. But here's what's important. It wasn't just bigger, it was better appointed. Because Caroline had learned something from her old ballroom. She'd learned that even the most exclusive space could become commonplace if you repeated it too many times. So the new ballroom had features the old one didn't. Better acoustics for the orchestra, more elaborate decoration, perhaps a musician's gallery instead of just a platform. Improved ventilation, important when you're packing hundreds of people in corsets and heavy clothing into one room. The upper floors held the private apartments. Caroline's suite would have been the most elaborate. A bedroom, a sitting room, a dressing room, a bathroom, all connected, all decorated to her personal taste. By this point in her life, mid-60s, Caroline had become even more obsessed with French style. Her bedroom was reportedly filled with Louis XVI furniture, delicate, refined, elegant. Pale blue silk on the walls, white and gold trim, everything designed to create an atmosphere of serene luxury. Her bathroom would have been modern, one of the advantages of building new in the 1890s. Marble fixtures, hot and cold running water, a porcelain tub, perhaps even a shower, which was still quite novel for private homes. She had a dressing room larger than most people's bedrooms, wardrobes filled with gowns, drawers for gloves, fans, jewelry, a full-length mirror, a seat for her lady's maid. This room was where Mrs. Astor was constructed each day, where Caroline, the person, became Mrs. Astor, the social force. The guest bedrooms on the upper floors were simpler but still luxurious. Different decorative schemes for each room. Ensuite bathrooms for important guests. Views over Central Park. And everywhere, throughout the house, that same message. This is old money. This is taste. This is permanence. But of course, we know now that it wasn't permanent at all. The house stood for just 31 years, built in 1895, demolished in 1926. Less time than some people live in a single apartment today. All that effort, all that expense, all that carefully curated beauty, gone. But in 1895, as Caroline moved in and prepared to host her first ball in the new mansion, she had no way of knowing that, in her mind, she'd built a palace that would outlast her, a monument that would ensure her family's position for generations. She'd built a castle against time, and for a few years, it almost seemed like she'd succeeded. Caroline Astor had done it. She'd escaped William Waldorf's hotel. She'd built her chateau. She'd recreated her ballroom. And just as she'd predicted, society followed her north. By 1900, Fifth Avenue between 51st and 91st Streets was transforming into the most exclusive residential corridor in America. The Vanderbilts built their palaces. The Carnegies erected their fortresses. Dozens of millionaire families abandoned the old neighborhood and raced to build near Mrs. Astor's new home. Caroline had won, or so it seemed. But empires, even social empires, don't last forever, and the forces that would eventually topple Caroline's reign were already gathering. Not from outside, but from within. Age was catching up to her. The world was changing faster than even she could control. And the very migration she'd led was creating a new Fifth Avenue, one that didn't operate by her rules. The war for 34th Street was over. Caroline had retreated, William Waldorf had triumphed, and Fifth Avenue would never be the same. But the war for Caroline's legacy, that was just beginning.